Thanks for joining here tonight. This will be the third time I've done a presentation like this, and every one has been a little bit different. But I really enjoy doing this. Again, my name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And I've worked as a consulting forester and as the Chittenden County Forester for some time before coming here. And so particularly in my work as the Chittenden County Forester, spent a lot of time working with landowners on small properties. And one of the cliche but really important sayings that we have in FPR is that small properties are a big deal. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that I think is really great about this stuff is that on a small property, the woods in your backyard there's a connection to them, and it's one that is in many cases more personal than some folks have on their 100 or 300 acres. The backyard woods are home, and so the opportunities to do projects out there are projects that really make a big difference, not just in what's happening on the land there, but how we feel about our own lives. And so I'm gonna point to that a little bit throughout the workshop today. But of all the things I want folks to be thinking about is that when we work on projects in our woods, that we really think about stewardship, and that we're doing projects that honor the value of the woods, and that we're taking care of our woods for the range of the things that they provide: habitat for wildlife, clean water, clean air, and that we're really leaning on a stewardship ethic, and that the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include the soils, the waters, plants, animals, or collectively the land. And Aldo Leopold said this: we can only be ethical in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. And I think some of this is best understood by those folks who have backyard woods, who have land that they can connect with and see the daily, monthly, or seasonal changes, or yearly changes, things that happen over time, and have the opportunity to connect with those places in meaningful ways. We connect with our backyard woods individually, but as we know, the impact of our choices are not isolated, and the impact of our choices cross boundary lines. And Vermont has 88,000 parcels. 48,000 of them are less than 10 acres. So just going back to that saying that small properties are a big deal. And when you think about a project, I encourage you to think about how you can work on your own land, but also consider how you can work with a neighbor on making a broader impact. I think when there are a lot of projects we can do, but I encourage folks to, before you dig deep in pursuing a project, know your land and love your land. Learn about your land and what makes it special. When we make management choices on our land, they are wonderful choices because they have a lasting impact. And as I know from experience, there are some activities that we can live to regret. And so those activities that I've done on my own land that I regret usually came from not understanding my land before I pursued the activity. So I really encourage folks to learn as much as you can about your land. Be patient. And I'll talk about some of the things that you can pay attention to in advance of pursuing projects. Simply, what trees grow here? Do you have cherry trees that produce fruit for birds? Do you have hemlock trees that provide cover for deer? Or in this picture, in the background on the right-hand side, there's a really stunted hemlock. That's one that's been chewed up by porcupine. The large tree in the center that my wife Susie's standing next to, that's a black cherry. And while it's really, really valuable saw timber, it also produces incredible fruit for a number of bears, birds like scarlet tanager, things like that. Other questions that we often ask, what animals are here? And we ask those questions after work or in the morning. There are other times a day where you can learn a lot about things that you don't see. And so what animals do you find at night? This is a gray tree frog on a bracken fern, about the size of my thumbnail. And other animals that you might find at night would include spotted salamanders during the spring or things like that. And once we recognize these animals are there, we recognize that they depend on something on our property and that they help provide context for the projects that we might pursue. They might inspire us to support their habitat, or they might help us put parameters on how to do a project on our property in a way that doesn't negatively impact these animals. What do you see during different seasons? There's all sorts of life happening throughout all of our woods, and many of us have patterns and ways of being on our land that expose us to our own land more during certain times of the year than others. And this is a photo of an otter sliding, or not an otter, but rather it slides in its tracks up and down a stream. And I've never seen an otter on the stream in my life, but knowing that during the winter this otter is around and it's looking for opportunities to feed gives me new perspective about what habitat this little feature provides. So again, learn your land. And when you begin a project, start with a light touch. It's one thing to have an understanding of what's going on your property. It's another thing to understand how your land or the plants there or the animals there respond to projects. And there's no better way to understand what works and what doesn't than by starting on a small scale. So experiment with temporary changes, watch how they work, and progressively make bigger changes. So I'm going to go through a few projects, and as Gwen mentioned, there's really an infinite number of possibilities, and I'm just going to throw a few out there that I think are easy to do, really help people to connect with their land, and are related to the values that we've all got for our own properties. One is preserving dead trees. Another is making brush piles. Another is supporting food for wildlife. And the other is maintaining cover and connectivity. And again, the projects that we can do can either support or advance these features on our own land, or we can just keep these things in mind when we are pursuing a project and make sure that we're not reducing the value of these elements of important habitat. Oh, a little too far here. I'll go back. So wildlife depend on dead trees, and as ever, the value of these dead trees always needs to be weighed against the hazard that they can pose to people and property. But as long as we're comfortable that they're not posing a significant hazard, recognizing that they provide really unique habitat for wildlife. This is a photo of a great horned owl in a small property in Heinsberg in March, I believe it was. No, that can't be true. There's a bunch of leaves. May. And I was walking with a landowner out here, and this owl had fledged from a dead pine tree behind it. And it's the kind of tree that somebody might say is a hazard or ugly or messy, but it was also home to this owl. This large pine tree is in Heinsberg, and dead trees. This is on the Heinsberg Town Forest, where there's Indiana bats, a federally endangered species, are known to roost. And dead trees offer roosting habitat for bats, whose populations are really getting hit hard by white nose syndrome. They also provide food for woodpeckers because they support large populations of insects that are feeding on the rotting wood, and the woodpeckers will go after those insects. Without these dead trees, there's really little habitat available for bats or woodpeckers, and so they really are critical. In the absence of dead trees, a landowner can put up a bat box on a house or on a pole. There are some really good resources. You can just Google or search on a web browser for bat boxes, and they're really affordable. Some of them are basically large condominiums for bats, and more recently, over the past couple of years, I've heard more and more people saying that they have bats living in their bat boxes. And I think that that's a really exciting thing to hear, particularly because the opposite had been true in the previous several years, where hearing a lot of people remarking about how few bats they were seeing. Another thing to support wildlife, which also helps a peeling backyard, is making brush piles. A lot of us burn our brush. I live in Winooski, and so removing brush and sending it to Burlington Electric is something that we do. Basically get rid of it. But brush provides really important habitat. It can provide habitat for rabbits, habitat for grouse, and provides really good cover for snakes or other rodents. And in turn, the cover that brush piles can provide can be a food source for things like owls or hawks, fox or fisher. So having a brush pile, having this cover can be really valuable for a lot of species, and can make a lot of sense. I've seen a lot of people who do work cutting firewood and really want an aesthetically pleasing backyard or backwoods on their property. They don't want to leave tops laying all over the place. And again, some folks will just burn them to get it nice and clean. An alternative is to clean up some areas and make piles of brush in others, and that can really support the wildlife habitat there while striking that aesthetic balance. And always keeping plants and trees that provide food. Mast trees and shrubs. Mast trees, or I'll back up, mast refers to the nuts or berries of plants. Hard mast would include things like acorns or beech nuts. Soft mast would include things like raspberries or cherries, and both of these are really important for wildlife. The soft masts are often really important because they have a lot of sugars and carbohydrates, providing a lot of energy for animals that are eating them. Things like acorns and beech nuts have a lot of fats, and particularly in advance of winter, the availability of nuts are really important for things like bear and deer and a lot of other animals, including coyotes or fisher, will eat the nuts, and helps us to sustain them throughout the winter. And also, low woody vegetation is really important for a lot of species. And this is something that I didn't know for a long time, but this is a picture of a black-throated blue warbler. And this is a bird that's has been really common, but is in decline in the Northeast. And Vermont is a really important breeding area for this bird. And this bird is only going to nest in woody vegetation between 5 and 15 feet in height. And if it's not there, they don't have a place to nest. And so this is, in sometimes this kind of vegetation conflicts with what we expect to look good or feel good in our backwoods. We want things to be clear and have a be able to see long distances in our woods. But I think if we understand that that low shrubby woody vegetation is really important for a lot of species, we might see it in a new light and hold on to it in places where we're able to. Another piece is that when animals compete for space, they don't just compete for a place, an acre. They compete for places within that forest. So some birds really are taking advantage of the space down low in a forest. Some birds are really competing for space up high. The same is true for insects feeding on leaves in a tree, or feeding on the forest floor, or feeding on trees in the understory. They are specialists, and they do well, or many species are specialists and will only do well in certain parts of the forest. And if those parts of the forest are lacking, they won't be as successful. So whenever I think about managing a forest, I try to think about keeping the puzzle pieces, that I've got stuff on the ground, I've got stuff that is called the mid-story, stuff that's between 5 and 15 feet in height, and stuff in the overstory as well, living stuff. And then in addition to that, I'm looking for dead stuff. I want dead stuff on the ground, I want dead stuff that is standing, and I want dead stuff with holes in it, cavities, for the great horned owl we saw a picture of earlier. And this is a picture that illustrates this. This is from the, I believe it's from Audubon. There's a landowner guide that they've got that I'd encourage folks to check out. It's about 50 pages and talks all about why birds need forests and how to manage forests well to support them. But again, this image basically covers what I talked about, that there's a whole bunch of puzzle pieces to a forest that make for good habitat, and working to manage to support these elements helps to keep a healthy forest. And then this isn't going to be true in all places, particularly in, where there's high density of small properties, but when you've got a small property that backs up against larger forest, you might see bear, and you might have bear-scarred beech. In fact, any tree that has those hard-mast or soft-mast species might be climbed by animals that are seeking to eat that food. Once a tree has been identified by an animal as providing good food, animals are going to come back to it. And so paying attention to cherry trees, oak trees, beech trees that have animal sign on it. Beech, just the way its bark grows, really shows the bear scarring like nothing else. But if you know that an animal is using these trees, hold on to them. Help them to grow better. And then softwood in particular is really valuable. It's really valuable, particularly because of it limits snow loads in parts of the forest, and that makes it easier for animals to move around, to escape predators, to find food on the ground, and it can also change the way that air moves through an area, and it can keep an area quite a bit warmer. It's not something that we would notice, but in some places it can be 5 degrees warmer underneath softwood cover, and for animals that are holding on to every calorie they can during the winter, those few degrees matter, and so keeping that dense softwood can be really valuable. So I encourage folks to try to keep it where you've got it. Then connectivity. Wildlife need to move, and our homes, the roads that connect them, can provide barriers to that movement. At the same time, the woods we've got can connect those places, and though we only may have a small little spot of woods, it may be a really key place for animals that are moving along the river. It might be a key place for deer that are trying to access a food source, and so or a place for salamanders to move from their wetlands to the upland area during the summer. So things like roads, development, agriculture, or lawns can change how valuable habitat is for connecting the habitat. One example of this is there were some bobcats in Shelburne that were collared, and every few minutes or every half hour, the collar sent out a GPS point of where it was, where that bobcat was. And it's no surprise, there's a lot of use of this wetland. Each of these yellow dots is where that bobcat was at some point, and the frequency of dots or the density of dots shows a place where that bobcat spent a lot of time. Looking at the left-hand side of the screen around the wetland, you can see that wetland was a really important place for that bobcat. Looking on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that there's agriculture there. There's a house, and the density of dots is highest in an area just to the right of this wetland. That could be a small backyard. You can see one portion where there's a shrub line, and that small little strip of vegetation provided the cover that made that bobcat comfortable to move from this area on the right-hand side of the screen and the woods over there to the wetland. And I think this is a good way to highlight that you may never see this bobcat. In fact, I've been working in the woods since about 2000, and I've never seen a bobcat in my life. But it doesn't mean that they're not out there, and it doesn't mean that the land we've got isn't valuable. And so using this to help trust your instincts, that if you've got some vegetation on your land that seems like it might link important habitats, I bet it does, and I'd encourage you to hold on to it and support it. So that's it for wildlife, and again, I'll be able to answer some questions related to that at the end of the session. We're going to move on to some stewardship activities for products. There's something incredibly satisfying about living your daily life and having something in your hand or experiencing something that came from your own woods. Sugaring is one of the classic ways you can have a project that helps to connect you to your forest. Harvesting your own firewood. Growing mushrooms is something that's gaining a lot of traction, and then there's other handicrafts that you can work with through stuff from your own land. Sugaring, there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can get some used buckets. There's a lot of folks, you'll see them at yard sales. I also see a lot of folks using 5-gallon buckets where they just tap a tree and run a line. They just set the 5-gallon bucket on the base of the tree, and they run a line down into it. In some cases, they have multiple taps from multiple trees running into the same bucket. But basically, tap the trees before the temperatures in the days get over 32 degrees. And when the temperatures of the days get over 32 degrees and the nights remain less than 32 degrees, that's when the sap is going to start to run and should be ready to boil. Some people will hold on to sap that runs during the week and boil that during the weekend. Some people will freeze it and hold on to it to boil it later. You can use a turkey fryer, or you can kind of do an old-fashioned approach and boil it with firewood. You can have a pan manufactured. There are some pans that are available from Leader and other manufacturers in the state. My first sap pan was a sink with the bottom welded shut, and that was a very classy approach as well. Cutting firewood. Cutting trees is one of the tools that any landowner can use to advance certain goals. If you want to support those trees that are growing mast or fruit for wildlife, trees need light, and for them to produce a lot of fruit, they need to be vigorous. If you want to have firewood, you got to cut trees. If you want to grow saw timber, you need to cut trees in order to grow those trees well. But one of the most important lessons that I learned is that when we're managing forests, harvesting a product isn't as much about what you're cutting as what you're growing. And I can't stress that enough. It's not as much about what you're cutting as what you're growing. In many cases, by cutting trees, you're supporting the growth of something else, and the products you harvest are incidental to that thing that you're growing. One of the ways one of the simplest ways to think about this is to think about all the values you have for your forest. And you may say, I want to grow saw timber. You may say that I want to grow good trees for wildlife. And using that example, say I want to grow good trees for wildlife, and I pick out a beech tree that has the potential to grow a lot of nuts. And so I look at that tree, and there's a lot of trees crowding it. And I'll go back here. A lot of trees, there's not a lot of sunlight coming through. None of these trees have a lot of light. What you can do is pick out that tree and cut around it. And that gives it more sunlight and helps it to grow fast. One of the ways you can start with this is to envision that any tree, the crown of the tree is the area with the leaves. And if you envision that the crown of any tree has 4 sides, and if you cut trees away from 2 or more of those sides, then that's going to significantly increase the growth of that tree, and that's going to help. So if you see 5 feet of daylight from the ends of the branches around a tree on 2 of its sides, it's going to grow better. And so that's one way to think about, if you're managing in your backyard, how you can help trees grow, get your firewood, but again, what you're growing is the important part. Cultivating your own mushrooms. A lot of the small properties we've got have small trees in the back. And if we're doing crop tree release, we may be cutting out a lot of small trees in the process. And you might use that for firewood. You also could grow some mushrooms with it. And there are some common mushrooms that folks are beginning to grow in Vermont. Oyster mushrooms are incredibly common. Shiitake, lion's mane. There are some good resources from Cornell Cooperative Extension about how to grow mushrooms. Oftentimes, mushrooms are grown from taking what people call bolts. Take a 4-foot bolt, and oftentimes it could be beech or sugar maple or oak, and people will purchase something called spawn. This is basically sawdust that's inoculated with the spores, and you take these bolts and you drill holes in it, and then you push the spawn into those holes, and then you drip some wax on the top of it, and that wax covers it up. And then you stack them as is shown in the picture here, and if it's really dry, you can water them. And certain mushrooms will fruit under certain conditions, but ultimately, after a year of sitting, the spores and the mushrooms will grow inside the wood, and eventually they will fruit, and you can harvest it just like going to the garden and picking your tomatoes. There are a lot of handicrafts that folks can create from their woods. In some cases, people will have the trees that fall down in their backyard milled up. There are portable sawmills, and either stopping by somebody who you see has one and bringing your wood to them and maybe trading them for some of the maple syrup that you boiled on your land to mill it up can also provide a lot of value to landowners. On the right-hand side, this is a picture of tapped sugar maple, and the trees had since been milled up, and this is becoming a very popular handicraft for people to take this wood from a single tree and get it milled up, and makes a really cool thing. But smaller projects, whether it's with your kids or things like that, creating walking sticks or things like that can be a lot of fun as well. In terms of recreation, oftentimes recreation is the way that we get outside and enjoy our own woods. I don't think that there's a better way to be outside for myself than to have a place to have a campfire. And on my own property, I have a fire pit in Winooski. I've got some land in Underhill as well, and you saw the picture of Amos at the beginning of this slideshow. I don't get a lot of chance to walk around as much as I used to, but a place for Amos and I to be together in the woods is also a place for us to hear what's going on around, to be quiet, to stay connected to that place. And the wood that we burn there is the wood that we cut there, and the wood that we cut there provide an opportunity to grow those wildlife trees better. And so it's just kind of a full package. And so if you don't have a place to sit by a fire, I think that's one great opportunity. Another, and this kind of goes back to that first, some of those first slides, having a trail system where you can move forward for long distances and really enjoy a space. This can be very difficult for small landowners to create. At the same time, there might be few things that are more valuable for a group of landowners to create for that community. Having a trail that crosses multiple properties helps give us a reminder that our property is connected to every other one, and we can see that and experience that, and not just in a theoretical way when we're walking on a trail that crosses many properties. In many of our communities, many landowners have their own individual properties, and that's offers privacy, which is totally necessary, but it can also be isolating, and the trail can offer everybody an opportunity to connect. And so if there are good relations between folks, and you can get a trail that can give folks the opportunity, easy access for exercise, to get out and be in the woods, to see each other in the woods, I think that's a really good project to work on. And birding. Birds are such cool animals, and they're everywhere. They are in our urban communities, they are in the woods, They are on small properties and big properties, and they provide such an important window into our natural world. You know, it's such a neat little creature that's cruising around eating food. You can start with the excitement of seeing the animal, but then understanding what they depend on. It can connect us to the natural world, and also for many, it's a competitive hobby. How many birds I saw today, people have life lists of how many birds they've seen during the course of their life, or how many birds I saw today of certain species. And people will pay attention to blogs of certain birds being in certain areas and will travel distances in order to see those birds. So that can happen out in the woods, or that can happen in your backyard. Paying attention to what birds use your land, what birds come to your bird feeder during the winter, can be another way to engage on your property. Going back to the image here, here's a picture of the Birder's Dozen. This is Audubon's kind of easy to remember, or relatively easy to remember, list of birds that really depend on Vermont, that use our forests. And again, not one of these birds will exist on or will be fully supported by a 5-acre property, but they are not going to survive without the many, many 5-acre properties that that we've got in this state. So again, the small properties are a big deal. Whenever you're doing a project, do it safely. There's no quicker way to get bummed out and disinterested in doing a project than getting hurt while you're doing it. Saw safety is one of the really important parts. Using a chainsaw is a really important skill for being able to manage your woods. Woods are defined by trees, and projects in your woods depend on tools to manage those trees. There are some really, really cool classes that teach chainsaw safety. Game of Logging is one, and they have a very effective way of teaching the basic skills of using a chainsaw, getting folks acquainted with the tool, and instilling confidence. There's a recipe that they've created that allows folks who have taken this class and to folks who have never run a chainsaw to pick up a chainsaw and cut a leaning tree and drop it on a pin 30 feet away from that tree. It's just a lot of fun. You do it with a group, and I encourage anybody who wants to manage their woods to take that class. The next is poison ivy. Poison ivy, or many other poisonous plants that we've got out here, and I said many others. We don't have a lot. Poison ivy is certainly the most common, but I encourage folks to become familiar with poison ivy if you're not already, and also encourage the kids that you play with to be familiar with it, because it's often not just their own comfort level in the backwoods that make it easy to be there. And ticks. Ticks are an increasing problem, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So as I said, take a chainsaw safety class. There's recipes, or the classes basically provide a recipe for how to cut down a tree. Things that you observe in the tree that tell you exactly how to cut it and where to drop it, and where to stand and where to cut from when you're working with a chainsaw. Again, knowing poison ivy, it's a 3-leaved plant, often at the joint of the leaflets. It's reddish. They're often found on sandy soil along rivers or lakes, but you can also find it in the uplands. And so just having a having an eye out for it is really important. And ticks. Growing up in Vermont, I never saw ticks. I grew up in Waterbury, and I didn't see a tick in Vermont until about 2004. And after that, they've been incredibly common. This picture is on the right-hand side of the screen is showing the cases of Lyme disease in 2014. And in many cases, folks think that Lyme disease is significantly underreported, often by 10 times. And I believe these numbers have gone up significantly. In addition, the ticks are also being found to carry other diseases, and many of which are they're significantly less common than Lyme, but they also are more significant. I really don't want people to steer away from going into the woods because of fear of ticks, but I really do want folks to plan on checking themselves and taking precautions. Wear gaiters, tuck your pants into your socks, use permethrin or bug sprays with DEET to keep ticks away. It's something to pay attention to, and again, getting embedded ticks or getting Lyme disease is a quick way to get discouraged from being engaged on your land, and if you prevent that, then you can continue to really enjoy your property. And then lastly, especially on small properties, I've seen that a lot of small properties, particularly in Chittenden County, people aren't as engaged in their woods. And because people have done a lot of planting of non-native plants around their homes, and people aren't paying attention to their woods in some cases, invasive plants can get really established on small properties. And so I strongly encourage people to really pay attention to invasive plants and prevent them where possible, eradicate them where possible, and where it's not possible to mitigate it. Oftentimes in big open woods, they're not very common, and it is possible to really prevent them from ever getting established. On my property in Underhill, I have very few invasive plants. On my property in Winooski, I have garlic mustard and buckthorn and barberry, and this fall I was in Underhill and saw 7 garlic mustard stems on a trail that I've been working with my tractor, and I can't imagine any other way than myself having introduced the garlic mustard, and was really satisfied that, okay, I recognize that I brought this plant here, I saw it on the ground, and before they got established or were able to throw seeds, I pulled them. And I don't expect garlic mustard to be a problem there. It was very easy. On the other hand, on my property in Winooski, I don't think I'll ever get rid of the garlic mustard. There's too much, it's too established. What I may be able to do is really pay attention to if and when I'm going up to Underhill, if I'm carrying seeds up there, so that I don't reestablish it up there. So as is the case with the garlic mustard, a small patch of invasive plants can be eliminated before it becomes a big problem. In this picture in the background, you can see the tall brown stems. That's Phragmites. There might be 25 stems of Phragmites there. This is the same, it's really a beautiful plant, but you see it in the median in the interstate in many places where it's acres upon acres of dense Phragmites. Once this is established, it's very difficult to get rid of. when it's at that scale that we see from the interstate. At this scale in the photo, it's really manageable. This is something that a landowner who's dedicated could pull this a couple of times and possibly deal with it. In other cases, as in this case with this landowner who's got a lot of barberry on their property, it's going to be really difficult to eliminate this infestation, but it really is important to control the spread, making sure that the areas that don't have a lot of invasive plants don't get it. I encourage folks who are dealing with what sometimes feel like an overwhelming burden of invasive plants to say the plant itself isn't the problem. The fact that the other native things aren't growing, that's the problem. And so just like the harvesting of trees, it's not about what trees you cut, it's about what trees you grow. When you have an overwhelming problem with invasive plants, focus more on making sure that native stuff is growing there than eliminating the invasives, if that is going to be impossible. So we're getting close to the end here. Just to run down the activities, hold on to your dead trees, make brush piles, grow trees and shrubs that produce food for wildlife, make sure that your projects maintain or support the cover for wildlife and the connectivity between habitats. If you want to grow products, sugaring, harvesting around firewood, growing mushrooms, or creating handicrafts from products on your property can be great. I encourage folks to build a campfire, work with your neighbors to build a trail, take up bird watching, do it safely, know your poisonous plants, take precautions to prevent ticks, and deal with your invasive plants. And that is all I've got.